Circling approaches are one of the most dangerous manoeuvres an IFR pilot can fly. However, most have never flown one in actual circling conditions before. A solid understanding of the procedures to be followed and how to fly the aircraft safely are prudent, day or night. In this episode, I review the whole process, including the upcoming changes to the AOP being published later this month. All this and more coming right up. So strap in and let's get into it.
Good morning, 3614, IFR Mallow 7 POB with Alpha.
Coordinating, Halo and runner, bank, balance, bank pressure rolling at 30 degrees. At 30 degrees there. Stand by, star 9000, 1013, KFR 25.
G'day everyone and welcome to episode 162 of the Flight Training Australia podcast, the podcast all about flight training and flying in Australia and beyond. G'day, I'm your host, Trent Robinson, and welcome to another cracker episode. 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. Very, very exciting. That is pushing me to make more videos. I know I keep saying this, but with the flying schedule, trying to get the podcast out, it honestly, and family time, of course, it leaves little time for anything else. But seriously, for those that aren't really got much to do with video production, and if you want to try and do a decent job at it, for every 1 minute of quality production you see on YouTube is around 2 hours of editing time, the filming, the planning, everything. So some things can obviously come out a little bit quicker, but is certainly more time consuming. And I'd rather not put out anything at all, but than cheap rubbish for likes. So I am chipping away. I do have some on the way, and I am trying to make the time to get them out more routinely. But you are just going to have to be a little bit more patient. But thank you for everyone coming on board. There will be some benefits and rewards for all of you that have subscribed. If you haven't, all the links are in the episode description, and you can look up the Flight Training Australia podcast channel on YouTube. There is also, of course, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can follow me there as well and see what I get up to every week. Right, I am in Broome this week over in Western Australia. So I'm going to be doing some instructor training up here, some FPCs, some OPCs, and hopefully catching up with a bunch of friends and podcast listeners. So if you're in Broome this week, keep an eye out on the socials. There'll be 1 or 2 nights where I'll be hanging out somewhere, either over in the Roebuck Bay area or Cable Beach or something. So you're more than welcome to come, say good day, and I'd love to catch up with you all and hear about your career thus far and where you're up to, and have a chat and share a beer. So coming out later this month in March 2025, if you're listening to this in the future, is some updated info on the circling area procedures, and out right now is AIC Hotel 09/25. And if you don't know what an AIC is, that stands for an Aeronautical Information Circular. It's kind of like a AIP NOTAM, if you like. And that is encapsulating the information and circling area guidance about the en route 1.1 changes that are coming. So if you do have an EFB handy, you can change the date from February cycle that we're in at the moment to the March one, and you'll be able to see these changes. If you try and look for them now, you will find the current rules. And this will be certainly pertinent if you are going to be doing an IREX exam soon or a IFR flight test. The theory questions that will be asked will be based around, and have to be based around, the current procedures and rules. So they are something you want to have a look at. If you do not have those handy, you can find them on your iPad. You can look up, as I said, Hotel 09/25. That's the Circling Area Guidance AIC, and AOP en route 1.5 on the second page. The circling area section starts there. And you'll see the big black lines right throughout for the first few pages, which is showing how it's all been amended and changed. So circling approaches, the purpose and the definition. Essentially, circling approaches allow aircraft to visually maneuver to align with the runway when a straight-in approach is not possible. Now, this can be for a number of reasons. It might be that it is a circling minima only, or you may have come in too high and too fast, but circling back around for the runway you approached at is possible if you climb back up to the circling minima. Or you might be coming in on a one approach airport and the approach is not into wind and you want to circle around to the other end. All right, so the circling area is a designated obstacle assessed area around the aerodrome that provides obstacle clearance subject to the category of aircraft you're operating at. And we'll get into that in a minute of what those obstacle clearances are. Now, our circling approaches do differ slightly from the FAA standards, and having distinct lateral dimensions and clearance criteria based on ICAO document 8168, which is all part of the PANS Ops guidelines, and that's what all our instrument approaches are designed against. That's the criteria on how our approaches are formed and the requirements that they need to have. It's not just drawing some lines and measuring some angles and putting it in the database. All right, so what are some of the key risks and challenges with circling approaches? Well, certainly everybody knows that to fly an approach at a runway and to continue coming down and landing off that approach is the most optimum ideal scenario. It's as minimal risk as it can be. The aircraft's set up, it's stabilized, it's configured. We're coming down on a typical 3-degree approach profile down to the runway, and everything's nice and calm and under control. However, circling approaches increase the risk of loss of control or terrain collision. Now, this is due to low altitude maneuvering, unstable approaches in marginal weather. Let's not forget what we're actually doing here. We are doing an instrument approach, potentially in full IMC. All right, so every time we change the configuration, the power settings, when we circle, some aircraft may have to raise the flap, raise the gear, only to redeploy it again later. All right, and that's not even talking about asymmetric conditions. All right, this can all lead to an unstable approach. Transitioning from instrument to visual and maintaining that visual reference. And of course, there's also the illusion of high speed, especially at night, not to mention along with black hole effect, making situational awareness absolutely critical. Now, pilots can and will and do underestimate these risks leading to unstable approaches. And as I said in the introduction, the biggest reason for this is because a lot of pilots have not actually flown a genuine circling approach. As I say to people, if you look at the circling criteria, it's typically around 2,400 meters visibility. Now, for what the circling area used to be, 2.66 for a Cat B aeroplane, that works out to about 1.2, 1.3 nautical miles. So that's already half the available circling area for the required visibility. And if you imagine looking out your left wing as you circle down to the runway, you can see the runway and not the other side of the runway. Just imagine that for a second. That is not very much at all. All right, so we really need to be thinking, what is a visual approach and a visual circling approach looking like when we're performing these maneuvers, which is usually in 8/8 blue sky most of the time. Right, but there's also another risk that I'm finding pilots often miss. Now, when we look at an altimeter, let's just say we've got 1,000 feet on the dial. All right, so it's pretty common that most people will say that, yep, I've got 1,000 feet below me and the ground. With the majority of our flight training occurring within 100 feet of sea level, most aerodromes are coastally orientated, and this unintendedly creates a dangerous mindset amongst pilots of being higher above the ground than we really are. So a crucial part of conducting the circling approach is proper planning and briefing, not just the minima, but the AGL altitude in brackets next to the published minima. So we actually know where we are going to be in proximity to the ground below. This is, absolutely crucial at nighttime. And I'm going to come back to this scenario in a little while. All right, so the circling area design and dimensions. Now, as we've all known, these are defined by arcs centered on the usable runway thresholds and then joined by tangents. So if it's just one runway, we get a bit of a oval shape. But if there's cross runways or anything else, it can be quite an interesting shape. And the concept of a usable runway is also an interesting one because some runways at night are not lit. Now, is that runway still usable without the runway lights? People argue this. Something to consider. I would generally say not. Now, the circling MDA, or the minimum descent altitude, ensures a buffer for obstacle clearance. Now, we have gone from set circling areas for each category, but now they have been removed. And this is one of the key changes to this whole process. So how are the circling areas being judged now? Well, the parameters that are affecting the circling area size now are based on the aircraft TAS at 1,000 feet above an aerodrome elevation, a 25-knot tailwind assumption during turns, 20 degrees of bank angle, or 3 degrees per second turn rate, whichever is lower, in ISA plus 15 degrees temperature conditions. So higher elevation aerodromes have a larger circling area due to increased TAS and turn radius. So the answer to the question, what is the circling area for a Category B aeroplane, is going to be, well, it depends. And it's going to depend on the aerodrome elevation. Now, some example circling area radii are for Cat B, because that's mostly what everyone's flying. For 0 feet, it's now 2.59 nautical miles is the suggested circling area. For aerodrome elevation at 3,000 feet, it increases to 2.77. So there's not a massive difference, but it is there to factor in these bits and pieces for the speed, the height, and the wind and everything else. So it does all sort of make sense, but it's now not a set circling area. Now, interestingly, everyone usually asks the question, how the hell do I visually gauge 2.66 nautical miles between myself and the runway threshold? And it's a fantastic question. And if you listen to the episode I last did on circling approaches, and from what most instructors I think would advise, is it doesn't really matter too much. Fly the normal circuit, and if you do that, you'll find that we're well inside the circling area. And interestingly enough, this is now the guidance in the ARC and the AIP update. So the process now is to maintain a normal circuit spacing, and that will keep you well inside the applicable circling area, which you don't need to go and calculate. Now, I'm not sure if Oz Runways or which you can put the circling area on is going to have a pictorial version of this now. They do show the 2.66 nautical mile circling area. I don't know if that area is now going to be based on the TAS and the elevation and everything at the aerodrome and diagrammatically change. It'll be interesting to see what happens. All right. Now, how do we go about flying these circling approaches and the recommended operational practices? So remember, the key here is the pilot must always maintain visual contact with the runway environment. Now, that means the runway, not the buildings or other visual cues that we can associate with it. All right. The runway is what we're landing on. That's what we must maintain visual contact with. But we need to take into account things like trees and other obstacles which may obscure the view to the runway. And daytime's okay. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky, but nighttime, a whole nother level. So the goal is to remain within the normal circuit area, not to use the entire lateral circling area boundary. Remember, the maximum circling indicated airspeed limits need to be followed. If they're going to be exceeded, you need to settle that down, or you need to consider a higher MDA if you're a faster aircraft. But if you're Cat B, 135 knots is the circling area limit. Now, wind conditions, this is going to impact manoeuvring, especially during your downwind turns potentially. So we need to plan safe downward spacing and the base turn execution to avoid exceeding these circling area limits. Now, the common accepted method to about face and circle for the opposite end of the runway is to break off on a 45-degree angle for about 30 seconds and then turn back parallel with the runway. And that should put you on an ideal normal circuit spacing with the runway. Remember though, exceeding circling area boundaries compromises obstacle clearance and increases risk. For those that have the fortune of training at aerodromes that do have terrain around them, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So factoring all these things in here, right, we had a situation a few weeks ago at night where the wind was howling and my student was struggling, trying to get onto the center line. We kept blowing through it and finding it really, really difficult to get the turn right with that tailwind on base. So instead, I suggested we fly a right-hand circling approach, which will give us a headwind on final instead. This then made the turn on the final much easier and stopped the huge overshoot. As I said, remember when we're visually circling, normal circuit procedures don't matter because other aircraft aren't going to be there. You're going to be on your own as long as it's not a no circling area, of course. The other thing to bear in mind, though, is on that side of the runway, the trees were much closer and this obscured the trees as the trees sort of obscured the lights and we only had a few runway lights in view at times. All right, so just remember at nighttime, I hope you get the chance to do some visual circling training at night because the visual cues available in daytime just aren't there and far more challenging. So thorough planning is absolutely crucial. And I'll touch on that a little bit later on in the next section, which is our visual circling restrictions. So pilots must not descend below circling MDA unless the visual reference is established and maintained, that runway threshold is in sight, and that gives us the obstacle clearance assurance for a stabilized approach. Remember, no circling areas are designated where obstacles prevent visual maneuvering. Now, formally, you could circle in no circling areas in VMC by day only. This is no longer the case. The statement simply now says no circling area means no circling. There is no caveat to allow it done at any other time. Another key change. Remember, once descending below circling MDA, pilots are responsible for ensuring visual clearance with any obstacles from the circling area. That obstacle protection no longer applies. So situational awareness of what is around and what is below us is absolutely crucial. Now, obstacle clearance minima for Cat A and B aircraft is still 300 feet and Cat D and C is 400 feet above the highest obstacle. But remember, not all obstacles are presented on the approach plate. So local knowledge is an absolute must. All right, an example. Back to my raised elevation scenario. Remember, it is not just the airfield elevation that you need to consider. The airfield may be surrounded by raised terrain and trees. For example, familiarization with this is crucial. Let's just say you're circling at a 720-foot MDA. You would normally leave 720 feet in a normal circuit, late base, all right? And that's how we circle right now. However, remember our scenario with the 1,000 foot on the altimeter. When is 720 feet not 720 feet? When the airfield elevation is higher than that below you. It might be, in this case, let's say 200 feet. That means we're already at 520 feet above the ground, assuming there is nothing higher than the airfield elevation below us. Okay, so there could be rising terrain out of the airport on the base leg, on the final leg, that is higher than the 200-foot elevation. So remember, it could be utilizing, and the approach design is utilizing the 300-foot obstacle clearance for Cat A and B aircraft. And so you're actually much lower to the ground than you realize. We might be 300 feet at one point, and then 400 feet, and then 300 feet again if there's a little hill in the middle. Okay, so prior planning is the key here. remember that when we are visually circling, it's not just a low-level circuit in VMC conditions that you might be used to. All right, take Kalgoorlie in WA, for example. A 2,080-foot circling MDA sounds nice and high, doesn't it? But the airfield's 1,200 feet, so you're only 877 feet AGL. All right, Chumut in New South Wales has a circling MDA of 2,130 feet, but that puts you 1,267 feet AGL. All right, so that means you're actually higher than you might think, but this also means you need to descend sooner. You would descend on downwind in that scenario because you're already higher than a typical circuit height. All right, so you really need to be mindful of what the circuit height is, what the airfield elevation is, and what the circling altitude or MDA is putting you above the ground. You might be reading 500 feet on final when you're actually only 200 to 300 feet above the ground. This all leads into black hole effect, our aiming point, our aspect of the airstrip and our airspeed, all those things that we normally use for a visual circling approach in daytime to verify and quantify that we are where we think we are in the circuit. All right, so safety considerations overall, I cannot stress enough that thorough briefing and planning is essential, particularly, of course, at unfamiliar aerodromes. All right, pilots should consult local pilots, instructors, examiners, or anyone else for the best circling practices and techniques and up-to-date NOTAMs and everything else for obstacles and elevation changes. And avoid deviation from published approach tracks, as this can absolutely compromise the obstacle clearance that is provided. All right, so hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight and something to think about, some food for thought. I encourage you to talk about it with your fellow students and pilots, instructors, and think about the aerodromes that you most commonly go to. Identify raised terrain or anything else in the approach path within the circling area, and it may be that you need to be 600 or 700 feet on final to clear that stuff safely before you actually then descend down. All right, I know we used to do a very similar thing of that at Careflight with some of the circuit areas that we had, and we don't particularly have a lot of raised terrain up here in the territory, but certainly at other locations throughout Australia, there is plenty to hit out there, so please be safe. All right, these changes will be in effect from the 20th of March this year, 2025, and you will be able to see those changes on the Air Services website now. You can look ahead, and it's all incorporated into the AIP. That AIC, again, is Hotel 09/25, and that will be reviewed again at the end of the month. That will basically be repealed, and the AIP will come into effect. Anything else is all available through the Air Services Australia website. All right, so just remember, circling approaches requiring high pilot situational awareness, precision, and adherence to the procedures. The updated guidance reinforces best practices for obstacle clearance, aircraft manoeuvring, and approach stability, ensuring safer operations under the regulations. All right, guys, that's it for me. I'll leave you all to it. In the meantime, please stay safe and remember the golden rule: aviate, navigate, communicate. Cheers, everyone.